When the war began, 2,000 members of the Shangan tribe had sought refuge in Mafeking. It was they who were to suffer most from the siege. A journalist in the town, Emerson Neely, watched them die.
Hunger had them in its grip. Many were living corpses, their ribs breaking through their shriveled skin. The sufferers were mostly boys from 4 or 5 upwards. It was one of the most heartrending sights I have ever witnessed, and I have seen many.
Baden Powell has been blamed for deliberately starving the Shangans in order to force them out of Mafeking and take their food for the whites.
It did enable Baden Powell to continue the siege longer, but the refugees who tried to leave the town were often shot by the Boer forces, and many had to return, preferring to take their chances in town and starve.
How many died of starvation?
Hundreds.
Baden Powell had a real problem because Kitchener ordered him in the middle of the siege to hold out for twice as long, and this really could only be done by sending certain people away, and Kitchener ordered him to do so in order to get their rations. Baden Powell didn't, in fact, stop feeding them as he'd been instructed. He instituted soup kitchens and fed them, although he did reduce their rations.
The whites suffered too, though not from starvation. 7 months of bombardment, disease and combat claimed the lives of almost 200 of the 2,000 whites in Mafeking. But Baden Powell's resolve never wavered. Throughout the siege, he led by example. A fellow officer noted his composure.
A shell whistled overhead. I hoped the colonel would take cover, but he didn't. A second shell sang a little nearer. He rose, whistling to himself, and as a third shell wrecked a couple of nearby buildings, he said, "You had better come inside."
For 7 months, Baden Powell succeeded in maintaining morale in the town by becoming the actor impresario that he had always longed to be. He opened a theatre and often played the leading role himself. There were even gymkhanas, made possible by the Boers' refusal to fight on Sundays. The British press, with no other good news to report from the war, contained daily dispatches from Mafeking. And when, after 217 days, the siege that Baden Powell had created was finally broken, the British public took to the streets.
It was absolutely sensational, and the country went mad. For 4 days, nobody worked. They had parties in the streets. The country just went absolutely bananas. And of course, Baden Powell was the hero of the hour. And he reached a fame that probably only the monarch enjoys in this country. Everybody in the country knew about him.
The troops from the war were cheered through the streets of London too. But after near defeat by Boer farmers, the ruling classes were fearful for the future of the empire. Baden Powell echoed their concerns.
The same forces which brought about the fall of the Roman Empire are at work in Britain today.
He firmly believed that urban pollution was enfeebling British youth. He was not alone. A parliamentary committee warned,
The deterioration of standards of physical health constitutes the gravest national peril.
fears for national safety were not entirely unfounded. Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, the youngest and strongest of Europe's empires, was seen as the likely aggressor who would bring war to Europe. And in war, only the fittest would survive. Could scouting save the nation? Baden Powell thought so. In an article for the Eton School magazine, he wrote,
"We are a small country, surrounded by nations who may at any time attempt to crush us. One great thing each boy can do for his country is to get together a squad of, say, 10 boys from his town or village and teach them how to shoot, how to scout, and how to drill."
Just as the Eton College article begins with the notion of England being surrounded by enemies, so the Boy Scout handbook begins with a discussion of Mafeking, which was surrounded by enemies. And it's quite clear that Baden Powell sees the metaphor of Mafeking as an indication of what England faces, that England is surrounded and is vulnerable, and the way to deal with that is to train lower-class youth to be prepared to fight for the empire. A dull lad who can obey orders, he says, is better than a bright one who can't.
What one has to remember is that Baden Powell was a soldier all his working life, and so of course he wanted boys to defend Britain and the Empire if it was attacked. That was very, very important to him. But it didn't come first in his thinking about the Boy Scouts. It was his desire to make boys into better citizens that was his greatest interest. The Good Turn, for example, was all about this. And then there was the prohibition of snobbery and the idea that Scouts were brothers to every other Scout. Happiness was all important in the Scout movement. He wanted boys to be happy.
In 1907, Baden Powell, now aged 50, organised his first camping expedition to test his ideas on scouting. In May, he sailed to Brownsea Island off the Dorset coast. With him were boys from Harrow, Eton and Charterhouse, together with local lads from the Bournemouth Boys Brigade. It was a daring social mix for Edwardian England. Equally novel was Baden Powell's instruction to the Brownsea boys to wear short trousers, at that time almost unknown in Britain. The boys would learn woodcraft and tracking, but Baden Powell also aimed to teach them discipline, as he explained in a letter from the island.
There will be instruction in life-saving technique and physical exercises and drill. One wants to teach the boys the quality of not grousing, and I think that may come as a result of training like that of Scouts. For they are not born grousing. There is hope if one catches them young enough.
Position it slightly further around that's great, that'll do.
Make sure it's taut here, okay?
Scouting was really about teaching the lower class boys to accommodate themselves happily to their lot. The Brownsea experiment, the 4 patrol leaders were all public school boys. The rest of the boys were working class kids chosen from the Boys Brigade. So scouting was not an experiment to cultivate aspirations. What Baden Powell wanted was Scouts to be happy with their lot. And I think it's interesting in this regard to look at the first version of the Scout Law published in 1908, in which Scouts are asked to be loyal to king, officers, country, and employers, not parents. And the reason for not parents was not an oversight. Parents were seen, working class parents were seen as part of the problem.
Baden Powell was frankly worried by the arrival of the Labour Party. He was very worried about the formation of unions and national unity. All this was very much in his mind. But he did have a genuine, love of all boys, and he was particularly keen on the idea of camping being something that would be helpful for boys who were brought up in inner cities, that they should get away to the freedom of the countryside and escape their everyday lives. And he talked about dead-end jobs and what a shame it was that people couldn't have a fair start in life. So his instincts were good ones, as well as him being controlled by, the neurosis of his class and the imperial spirit.